I was born in London, northwest London, and I always loved theatre and film, and did direct it. I started directing and acting in plays at school, and then went to university, did an English degree, and in the sideline, did lots of plays that meant I never got my essays in on time. I guess I was sort of that's really what I wanted to do, but I didn't know if I was any really like any good. And I think university, those productions helped me feel confident about giving it a go professionally. And I started, I mean, I've been directing theatre for about 20 or so years, so since the late 90s when I started working. And yeah, that's a whole bunch of, that's a long story in itself, but I've been freelancing and working in house at theatres ever since. So I have run my own company. And I started off as an assistant director and was very lucky to win a bursary that gave me the opportunity to direct my first production. And then I was hired by a bigger theatre company to be an in-house assistant director, and the usual story. So it goes from there. They were very kind and generous, and gave me a big show to direct, and it just builds from there. And then kind of there are periods where it's going really well and you're very busy, and periods where you're less busy and less in work, and it's just a tough old game. Like all of this is a tough old game. You just have to kind of drive at it really hard all the time. But yes, I ran a theatre company, and then I've also was the associate director at the National Theatre Studio, which is where the National Theatre in London develops a lot of its new plays. So it was a place where I didn't work on these, but it's the place where, for instance, Warhorse, the theatre show, and the Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime were developed. So it produces some very big hits, but it's like an R&D and development lab for the main theatre, which is a brilliant place to work. And I also more recently was the associate director at Leeds Playhouse, which is one of the big producing theatres in the country. And then all the while along that, I was working in smaller sort of bite sizes in film.
It's interesting that the films that you've done are primarily adaptations or variations on different plays, including Shakespeare. So what made you decide that you wanted to go into filmmaking?
Well, I mean, I would always honestly, it had always been on my list to do. I'd always wanted to do that. And I think sometimes when you work in theatre, you see that directors do transition into film anyway. So I was hoping that would happen somehow or another. And whilst I tried to build up my theatre work, the way it happened eventually was unplannable. I had this extraordinary coincidental meeting with a producer on the Tube in London. I was on my way into work, and I directed a play called The Circle, and it'd been a very successful experience for me. And I was sitting on the Tube a couple of years after having done it, and a guy was sitting next to me. He looked like a banker on Dress Down Friday, and I was bored. I had nothing to do, and I was being nosy, and I looked at what he was reading, and I thought I'd find he was reading some very boring sort of financial report, but he was actually reading reviews of an American production of this play, The Circle, which was very rarely done. And I just said, "Excuse me, sorry, can I ask why you're reading that?" And he said, "Can I ask why you're asking?" And I said, "Because I directed that play 3 times in the theatre." And he said, "That's amazing. I just optioned the movie rights." And he was a producer who was on his way into Warner Brothers to sort of to finish up agreeing on some sort of residual territorial rights for this property, as they call it, this thing that he had the rights for, this play. And we talked, and we met up a few days later, and as only an American would, I think, he said, "Do you want to have a crack at the screenplay?" And I was, most people wouldn't have given someone like me that opportunity. For some reason, he saw my reviews of my productions and he thought it was worth it. So I wrote my first feature screenplay for his company, and then I wrote another film for his company, another adaptation of another play that he had by Somerset Maugham that he had optioned, and that's really where I learned how to just hammer out a script. And I went through a process with script editors, and I just sort of I had to work out how to shape an image on final draft, how to set up a scene, how to punch into a moment. And I guess that's why I sort of if I've got an instinct or an eye, that's where I sort of honed it.
So you did The Circle, and you've done these films, and then we're going to come on to now talk about Ganef, which is up for possibly competing the Oscars and BAFTA. Tell me about the inspiration for this very, very powerful story. Where did you get the ideas from it for it?
My mum's mum was a survivor of the Holocaust, and I guess I growing up in the 80s in suburban North London, with the trauma of the Holocaust never really far from view, and there was always sort of absent elderly cousins and great uncles who hadn't made it out alive, or a rolled up sleeve that revealed a concentration camp tattoo at a tea party, or some irrational guarded behavior rooting back to childhood spent on the run or in hiding, or my grandmother or members of her family had survived fearing death when at every turn, and we'd hear these stories, and I guess I internalized what to some extent what they'd gone through and their fears a bit. And for Ganef, I just wanted to then take this tiny domestic moment, a confusion over some shopping bags and a bungled explanation to a little girl, to explore how their trauma lived on in those tiny details for years after the tragedy that caused it, and how that trauma then got passed on to the next generation.
As teenagers during the 80s, that's kind of when the whole Holocaust denial argument started to really take hold. There was more discussion in fiction work about it. There was more news articles about it. Growing up and hearing these stories, and it igniting your, I don't want to say imagination, but igniting your memory of that in much the same way that your main character in the film has her imagination fired up. How did you feel about that notion that such a horrible thing could be easily denied? And how do you feel about it now that it has really taken off as a movie?
I mean, it enrages me, honestly. I only need to look at my own family tree, which has been put together by my mom and other people through research, through archives, to know that we are but one of millions of families who, I look at my family tree, that just is like one branch of it taken from that period of time, and it just says murdered, Auschwitz, Birkenau, shot in a forest, that of 40 relatives, 20, 30 of them were murdered systematically all around Europe. So it, just from my experience, just from my family's experience, I know that what is being said is just ideological. It's there is a need to deny it that is beyond fact. There's a need to imply something about me, about Jews, that is to do with us making stuff up to some end. There's a really interesting thing about Holocaust denial. Holocaust denial is necessary to an anti-Semite, because the anti-Semite needs to prove that the Jew is not a super creature. How can you have had a Holocaust if this super creature that controls all the economy and controls the world could be decimated by another group? How can you be so superior if you can't control that? So in some ways, they need to nix the idea of the Holocaust in order to kind of restore their first insult. I mean, it's absolute madness. It's a highly documented tragedy of beyond your wildest nightmares. It happened. Millions of people were killed, not just Jews, Romani gypsies and political dissidents, homosexuals, and it happened. And I feel like I come from another planet if I ever encounter that kind of insidious hatred.
Thank you for being so very candid and heartfelt in your answer there. So going back to the film then, the setting is interesting because it's less than 20 years since the end of the war and this horrible thing happened. So it's all very much fresh in people's minds, the trauma is still there. Presumably that's why you chose to set it at that particular point in time. But what's really interesting is that much of the film is told through the child's viewpoint. We're never really told exactly what's going on. How hard or how easy did you find writing it and shooting the film to take the child's perspective? Did you tap into anything internal, or did you just try it out, see how it went?
I knew that it needed to be a young child's point of view because I needed, if the child was older, their logical brain would have probably stopped to consider other possibilities, that the cleaner wasn't stealing, or stopped to ask, to just behave more rationally. So it was quite liberating to be able to imagine an age. I mean, the girl we cast was I think 6 when we shot it, and 5 when we cast her. And it just, even as I was casting, I realized, because we met older girls for the part, that it really needed a younger girl to make the film credible, that she would behave in this way, because her rational brain is not as high functioning. So yeah, it was quite liberating to imagine the world through the eyes of someone who is much more governed by their impulses and their emotions than by their logic. And I think I just, maybe I was tapping, I don't know, maybe it's a good question. Maybe I was tapping into my own, I'm sure to understand the child, you have to sort of be able to sort of vaguely tap into how you remember being, or how you imagine a children to be. Doing their best, trying to protect her home from some imagined threat, and sort of working out a story in which she can do that. Yeah, I mean, it was kind of fun to write, and it was quite, as I said, quite liberating to get rid of logic.
What's interesting about the film as well is that it deals with the shattering of innocence, if you like, but not the death of it, but certainly the shaking of it. And we see that in the film, where and you've chosen an interesting story for the mother to tell her child. I'm not going to say too much about what that story is. Let people find out for themselves when they see it. But with so many horrible things that went on, the story you chose was still terrible, but not what you would expect, and it still had the same impact. Was that a conscious choice to use that particular story?
I think I remember my grandma telling me something like that, or sort of hearing that come from someone. That's something about if they don't know what you've got, they can't take it from you. I think was a line which is in the film that I probably heard somewhere. The paranoia that builds up when you've been on the run and in hiding. But yeah, you're right. I wanted in the film generally to avoid being too heavy-handed or too obvious about how the Holocaust specifically lands in the world of the story. And I remember at one point in the edit, it wasn't actually clear enough. And my producer, I think, said to me, just, we were able to do some ADR on it, and I could rewrite a couple of the things that were said. And she just said, just use the word Nazis. And I just like, I don't want to hear that word in the film. I want to be able to suggest something without that kind of more clunky approach to storytelling. So I think, I was trying to be more oblique about the Holocaust, and not sort of go too deep. And I don't think that the mother would have. I think the mother is trying to avoid. I think in the moment you're not describing very kindly, she's trying to find some example of something that is a little bit less, terrifying. I mean, she's obviously seen much worse than that, and perhaps could say much worse than that, but she's trying to protect her child.
The thing that came across is that this was just another example of how those terrible, terrible events, it's disingenuous to call them events, but it's the only word I can think of.
Yeah.
Continued to take lives, even of those who weren't there, like the young girl in the film. So is that something that you thought maybe was trying to get across, that long after this had happened, although the events of the film are quite recent, the Holocaust, but long after this happens, those horrible things continue to, to traumatize and take lives and take innocence.
Yeah, yeah. It's exactly what the film is. I'm trying to say with the film, I think, is that, I mean, there are a number of things, but like, I think beyond the Holocaust, I think we are still, as a species, very, very out of tune, or certainly governments that make decisions about going to war in other countries seem to willfully ignore that the fact that when you damage through violence, any group of people, any family, any individual, the impact of that violence will shape the behavior of their family for generations to come. And I think we are comforted in some mad way by news cycles that the news cycle ends, and so maybe the pain is just going to sort of fizzle out. And every time a missile is fired into a market square, to be cliched about sort of violence that we see on the news, that is going to affect those families and those individuals for generations. The reason that the film, I wanted to just come back to something you said earlier as well, that they're set in the 60s, is because I wanted to find a time. I wanted to show Holocaust survivors as young people. We now associate them with either they're not around anymore or they're very wrinkled and old, but I wanted to show a vibrant young woman who had survived, and I and remember that they were young ones, that they weren't alien old sort of geriatric people struggling to remember what happened. And also in the 60s, and you were talking about the 80s and Holocaust denial. I think that the reason Holocaust denial started to really kick up in the 80s was because survivors started to speak. It wasn't until that time, and then with the great documentary Shoah, which is sort of 9-hour epic about the Holocaust, and then also in the 90s Schindler's List, that Jewish survivors or Holocaust survivors began to have the confidence to feel that their experience had been validated by culture. In the 60s, that woman in the film wouldn't have even probably spoken to her husband about her experiences, let alone her neighbor. And so she's sitting on all of this trauma and not having nowhere for it to go. Probably not therapy, probably didn't even occur to her. She probably thought what she went through was shameful. And so it was very important that for the story to work, you have a character who has nowhere else to go, is repressing those painful experiences, and they're sort of leaking out past this very shimmering, affluent surface that she lives in.
Now, it's a short film, but you've packed so much themes and stories and ideas into it, so it almost has a big feature film feel to it.
All right.
Is that something you would like to do with this story? Is explore it on a much bigger cinematic stage?
Yeah, and sure, I'd like to. I've got a couple of ideas. One which sort of extends the story of the short specifically into a feature-length version. I've got another story idea which is also drawn from family, but is not specifically that house and those characters. It's and set in France, in Paris. So I'm noodling around with them, and there's some notes and some beginnings. But yeah, I really want to do that.
Okay, well, let's talk about now how the film's being received. It's been doing despite COVID pandemic, it's been doing the festival round, and it's getting some good feedback. So just share with me some of the highlights of how it's been recognised, and what have people been saying to you about how they've received the film.
Well, we have been on the film festival circuit for about 18 months, roughly, through COVID, and I'd never done that before. I've never been on the festival journey. So in some ways, like, our validation has come from, and also because of COVID, we've been unable to attend. So I've had quite a limited direct feedback about the film from people that have watched it, because although we've been in the festival circuit since like summer, I guess, early summer last year, I only actually got around to seeing it in a cinema with other people at a festival about 2 months ago, when I went over to Albania, to Tirana International Film Festival, to see it there. And even then, because of COVID, there weren't that many people in the cinema. But so it's been limited, and that's been frustrating. But I've had messages from other filmmakers who've seen it in festivals, and really positive, lovely things. Likewise, you try and say the same, reach out to other filmmakers when you see their work online on online festivals. We've played in a lot in the States. We've played at a lot of Oscar and BAFTA and BIFA and affiliated festivals, which has been really brilliant in itself, just a brilliant validation for the film. So yeah, we played at Holly Shorts and LA Shorts and Chicago Children's International Film Festival, and I mean, we've played about 30 plus film festivals to date. So that's been great. We've managed to have some, have the film bought by a couple of companies for broadcast in Europe, and so that again, it feels really validating, and like an amazing thing to make something and have someone pay for it, to screen it. I'm trying to think what else, and then more recently, during the Oscar, the sort of pushed, I guess the campaigning from now that we're Oscar qualified, we've had some really, like yourself, really wonderful, some really lovely write-ups. Slowly, we hadn't had those before, so this is more recent, and I was a bit nervous about that, because the longer you wait for reviews, I guess the more fearful you are that it was just your friends telling you that they like the film. So yours was lovely, and we've had some terrific reviews from other places.
Have you got any other film projects lined up that you'd like to pursue?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm actively working on the feature version and the alternative of Ganef. I'm developing 2 other adaptations with co-writers. I'm working on a TV show, which we've just sold the idea, and it's in the early stages of development, and which is really exciting. And I'm writing a play for a theatre in London. What I'd also really like to do, if I can come up with another good decent idea, is to make another short, because it's such a great way of, like, short term flexing your muscles and really distilling an idea down to something very precise, and you just can. It's more something you could turn around more in the shorter term, because films, as you know, will take forever and a day to get financed and made. So yeah, it's busy.